Welcome, everybody, to How to Measure Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm so excited to be with you today. Thanks for joining. We're going to interact throughout our hour together, so be prepared. We're going to have a breakout room activity here shortly after we do some introductions. There was a link I shared with you for a pre-read article. If you haven't had a chance to read it, it's super short. You can pull it up. I will share the link on the screen as well as in the chat that you're going to debrief in that breakout room exercise. Really just meant to get you primed and thinking about this topic. And then we're going to cover the gamut of how to think about metrics, how to think about data, and what to include with some best practices. If I haven't met you yet, this is me. I am Julie Kratz. I am founder and CEO at Next Pivot Point, my business that I started 6 years ago before spending time in corporate America for a dozen years, doing a lot of people leadership work in different industries. I'm an author. I've written books about allyship in the workplace, most recently Lead Like an Ally, the journey through corporate America to facilitate inclusion. I'm very passionate. My passion started out from a gender perspective, but as much as we've seen over the last several years, really got into anti-racism work, privilege, understanding unconscious bias, and all the different dimensions of diversity. So that's something I'm genuinely passionate about. The reason why I have little ones, I have girls in my life that I certainly hope they're not having the same tired conversation about why diversity, equity, inclusion is important and how to measure it when they enter the workforce. I hope we're beyond the conversation we're going to have today, 20 years from now. I had the opportunity right before the pandemic to do a TEDx talk on diversity and why it's important to me. And I had a baby also last year at the end of last year. So 2020 was a wild year for everybody, myself included. But why I do what I do is genuinely having these girls and just wanting it to be a better place for them. This next generation cares about this. I think we've all cared about this, but spun our wheels in corporate settings, not being able to get uh, momentum, lasting momentum. I certainly realized that in my own corporate career. So it's got to be better for them. That's why I do what I do. If you haven't introduced yourself in the chat yet, go ahead and do that. Name, role, why you're here with us today. And be sure to connect with people offline. This is a great way to get to know people in different spaces that have similar challenges, but maybe different ways to approach it. So the agenda that we have for you today is first, we're going to talk through prioritizing data that truly drives diversity and inclusion. There's so much data out there. Leaders come to me with like, what do I measure? Just tell me. And I'm not going to tell you what to measure today, but I will give you ideas and guide you through some exercises on how to craft meaningful metrics that really are activity based as well as demographic based. I think our tendency is to keep the conversation super focused on race and gender and demographics, which the pros and cons of that is they're very clear from a pro perspective, but the con of that is it becomes a zero-sum game sometimes with the majority group saying it's just about those two dimensions. It's not about other things, which isn't true, but certainly leads to that mentality sometimes if you're not careful in communication. Which brings us to the last point. We'll talk about how to create a dashboard, also called a scorecard. I think scorecard kind of plays into the zero-sum game. Use whatever language that matches and mirrors the culture of your organization. But the key word here is accountability. So anything that's important in our business and our organization, we have accountability metrics around. Same goes for diversity, equity, inclusion. And though, unfortunately, when I ask corporate leaders about what they're doing on accountability of measurement, they're usually like, they don't usually have a good answer. So if that's you, if that's your organization, you are not alone. I always like to start off with some rules of engagement. So be prepared to interact. I want to hear with you. I want to hear from you. We would like to hear from everybody. So I'm going to have a lot of different questions coming up. Please, please, please engage in at least one of these questions and certainly your breakout room exercise. We want honesty. This isn't about being perfect. There is no perfect ally. There is no perfect diversity, equity, inclusion organization or industry for that matter. And that certainly this conversation comes with imperfections, and that's part of the beauty of it. And it's a brave place to be your full self. So please, please, we want to create an inclusive place. So reserve judgment. Let's stay curious and help each other and come at it from a place of positive intention. Those are the rules of engagement. Hopefully by now you've had a chance to introduce yourself to the broader group. The pre-read activity that I shared with you was to read this article and share a takeaway in your breakout room. I'm going to go ahead and send you to breakout rooms. If you haven't had a chance to read this article, I will put it in the chat as well. I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to share. You'll have 3 or 4 people in your room to just unpack, like, what was one thing you learned from it. Feel free to, of course, introduce yourselves as well. I'm just going to give you 5 minutes, so be brief, be to the point, but I want you to have a chance to interact with some folks and get to know everybody. So before I do that, let me just escape out. I will put this link in your chat. So if anyone hasn't had a chance to read that, you can pull that up and pull out a key takeaway. And I'm going to send you to your breakout rooms. So here we go. We'll be back in 5 minutes. I'm on Eastern time, so I've got 12:10, so 12:15. I will bring you back. So just kind of watch the time. You should have 3 or 4 people in your room. I'll see you back in 5 minutes.
There's Julie. So
Saying hi,
Hi,
listening.
Julie. There.
Yeah, I thought it was a good article too. I think, that leadership piece is really important. I think one of the biggest challenges is getting that data beyond leadership. I think a lot of organizations struggle with how to tell the diversity story and how we're making progress or not making progress. And then, what's driving that. So the data is a super important piece.
Yeah.
Lisa, how big is your company? Where do you work?
Well, I'm home based, like everybody, to pay more attention to our metrics and maybe ones that we're not paying attention to right now too.
Awesome. Nice to meet you.
And I'm Alyssa Green. I'm a consultant at Axiom, which is in Chicago, just a consulting firm. I'm working part-time there because I'm also
although I've been in this space for quite a while. I just joined a regional bank as their first chief diversity officer. And so one of the things that as I'm going back through my repertoire, if you will, and was a reminder for me as I read the article, was that the data is the what, but the so what matters so much more. And so focusing on that so what and giving that message of what the, what I'm seeing in the data, but then what's the so what.
Suggesting. So very interested in this area and look forward to the conversation.
Great.
Thank you.
Tiffany?
So I'm Tiffany White. I'm the head of engineering operations for Rolls-Royce. And one of my responsibilities is to ensure that we have the right number of engineers, but also the right engineers with the right skill sets. And that includes the D&I metric. So as you might imagine, in a defense
because different countries have different, different points of view. When I talk with people in France, it's like, oh no, there's only one race, human race. And I'm like, okay, no, that's not true. So trying to get them to go outside of
So as y'all are coming back, feel free to share anything that bubbled up for you in your breakout room. I bounced around. I got to a handful of rooms, but I admittedly did not make it to them all. There was some great discussion going on. So any ahas or thoughts you have from your breakout room, feel free to share either in the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute themselves and share, you're welcome to do that as well.
This is Ileana, and I
Hello.
was in the room with Rome. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And what I learned, I mean, being in public sector for such a long time, is that really there's not much difference when we start talking about D&I or DEI in the public and private sector, yet maybe the way we go about doing different things may be.
Yep. I hear that a lot. Well, in my industry or in my sector, I like to think diversity is just a problem that affects this industry. And I can tell you, as somebody that's been across so many different industries, it's the same problem. It just shows up in different ways. And of course, there's spaces that are more male dominated, more white dominated. But for the most part, the last stat I think I saw was 82% of Fortune 500 companies are led by white men. So if you think this is something that's just happening to you or your industry, it's not true.
Yeah.
Oh, the E. Yep, Tiffany, I'll jump in on that. I'm going to back up and explain the E a little bit. It's equity, but we'll explain that.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. I made the mistake of not explaining that as well. Us and our acronyms, it's very easy.
I know. It truly is.
Awesome. So as other people are joining, I think we've got everybody back here. Other ahas, other takeaways. Thanks, Eliana, for sharing. And someone asked about contact info. You do have in the calendar invite, you should be able to see each other's emails. I just ask that you be kind and, ask for permission to contact somebody via email that way, or certainly send a private chat message if you're interested in getting to know somebody offline, or you can look for their name on LinkedIn as well. Other thoughts? I make sure to get to the meat of the conversation. So the three things I heard as I bounced around, I heard leadership has to be involved. Yes. So one of the first questions I ask about when I'm talking with clients is, tell me about your leadership team and how they talk about diversity. Says a lot if they're not saying a lot. The second thing I heard is, it's not just the data, it's the so what with the data. So I'll guide you through. Yeah, it's great to capture all these data pieces, but what are you going to do with the data? Why does it matter is a bigger, more important question. So what? And then I also heard the point about industry. So Ileana kind of mentioned that as well, that this is a challenge that's happening everywhere. So there's certainly no one is immune to this. And I think certainly we can see in the light of even last summer that this is happening much more broadly than I think we even realized inside organizations. I'm just going to quickly mute.
Julie?
Yep.
Can I offer one that we talked about in our group was
Please.
around the idea that having a diverse organization doesn't necessarily mean it's an inclusive organization. But an inclusive organization is more likely to be one that also has diversity. And so there was even the thought about maybe the lead with inclusiveness or inclusion versus leading with diversity may be an approach to consider in terms of how to think about this in organizations.
Yeah, and you've even seen title swaps with I and D. The I or the D. The I drives the D. So, but a lot of organizations are like, I just need to recruit. I just need to find diverse talent. Well, they're not going to say, of course, they're not going to want to even work there if they don't see themselves reflected in the organization and feel included in the organization. As human beings, that is a very primal need that I think we've overlooked for so long in the corporate landscape. This need for belonging, this need to feel included. People just don't stay places they don't feel included or feel like they belong. Some of the data on this, I know the business case is super tiring with this. If y'all have been doing this work a while, you're well familiar with these. I only share this because if you haven't seen it before, or you're looking for data to justify to your leadership team that this is important, these stats, so this is from Forbes, this is from Harvard Business Review, this is from McKinsey and Company. These are just three stats. There's thousands of stats to support the business case for diversity and inclusion. But often I find with my clients that just making sure people understand this, us in the trenches doing DEI work a lot, might take for granted that people know this. And I'm continuously surprised by how few people are familiar with this data. So again, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, highly encourage you to subscribe regularly to their communications. They're doing a phenomenal job with diversity and measuring it, as well as McKinsey and Company, their annual report does a great job. So some best practices I would offer, in addition to what I shared in the article and heard from y'all, 3 things that make measuring this important. You have to be doing these things as well. You have to be intentional about diversity and equity and inclusion in your organization for this to work. And this is why measurement is a piece of being intentional. So we measure what we want to get done. We inspect what we expect, right? So we are intentional and we are intentionally measuring it. You have to be consistent. So I have a lot of clients that do an annual diversity event. That is not what I mean by consistency. It needs to be much more frequent than that. Leaders need to be talking about it. Managers need to be talking about it. Everyone in the organization needs to feel like this is consistently done over time. And I'm not saying daily, but probably monthly, at least quarterly, having communications about this and being transparent about where you are, especially if you're not where you want to be. Because again, no organization is really where they want to be. Very, very few are. And leadership, to ditto that term, the leaders have to be involved. The senior leaders have to care about this for it to ever work. Because the first time that a distraction happens and we veer and say, oh, we got to do this instead of the diversity event, everyone knows it's not important, right? Everyone knows that diversity isn't as important if leaders prioritize other things over it. It's really not that type of work. You can't just kind of halfway do it or check the box do it. So to the point earlier, I know Tiffany asked the question about what some of these terms mean, just to set when I say diversity, and of course I don't own the diversity dictionary, but if I had to kind of generally sum up what DEI means, diversity is different groups of people, and groups is really important. So we never want to call an individual diverse. It's always groups, and they tend to be based on these big 5. So just kind of think about this with metrics. Most of the organizations I work with isolate gender and race. I would say go beyond that. So ethnicity is another piece of the puzzle that's not the same as race. Sexual orientation, although that's something that is not always transparent, that 50% of people are closeted in the workplace today, for example. That includes gender identity too, with non-binary and other pieces of the gender spectrum, as well as abilities, someone having a disability. Equity, so that if you see the E in the conversation, a lot of organizations are adding the E right now to the same as I before D, so however you want to work these alphabet letters, words matter and they're really important. You may have seen this graphic before about equity versus equality, which I think does a great job of dispelling, this metaphor of having the fence as a systemic barrier. The fence is the constraint, much like other constraints that exist inside organizations that hold certain people back that are in the non-majority group. Here, if we give everybody the same resources, this is equality. So if people say, well, we just treat everybody equally, give everybody the same box, well, the person that could see before can see more, and the person that couldn't see before still can't see. Versus equity is shifting the supports and giving more support to the people that are most marginalized. And then truly everyone can be equal in that scenario. Of course, we want to get rid of the fence and the systemic barrier altogether. We are years away from that. I just heard that from a gender perspective, we're 257 years now from gender equality. Last year, we were 208 years. So this is troubling. You can only imagine when you add in other dimensions of diversity with race and ethnicity and others, how complex this is and how much the systemic barriers still have a long way to go. Now, the I piece, so DEI is the most common acronym, although obviously you want to use what's best suited for your organization. I call it a sense of belonging for diverse groups of people. So thinking about, do I feel seen? Do I feel heard? Do I see myself reflected inside organizations? Do people invite me to meetings? Do people listen to me at meetings? Do I feel like I belong there? It's really, really, again, that human primal need. So I'm curious, I've got a question here in the chat. So anytime you see one of these blue boxes, I want to hear from you. So go ahead and jump on the chat. How does your organization define it? Do you use DEI? Do you use D and I? Do you use I and D? There's also another word getting floated around, the B, with belonging. And I'm just going to flip through messages, see some messages coming in. Okay, awesome. LaPonda posted something on our LinkedIn page. DE&I, says Lynn. D&I, DEI. Oh, global. I haven't seen that one yet, Ray. So you added a G to it in front. DEI. Ooh, justice. And Monica has. That's a good one. I've seen that one a few times too. Good, 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 good. IND, DEI, DEI. So yeah, DEI tends to be the most common. Oh, there's an A for accessibility. So awesome. So flip through those chat. That'd be a great polling exercise to do. I think DEI seems to be the majority, but IND, DNI, and some extra letters being added to this. So bottom line is you have to do what matches the culture of your organization, the words that you would use regularly in a day-to-day communication. This shouldn't feel different. This should feel synergistic with who you already are. Okay, so the first thing I promised that we'd get into, and we'll do some activities on this, is how we prioritize data. So I'm going to give you a few ideas in addition to what I shared in the article. Think about what data points your organization is measuring, and maybe they're not measuring them yet, but maybe they're data points you could measure. I like to talk about it from the employee experience level. So when I say employee experience, I mean everything from how people are recruited to how they're hired, to how they're promoted, to how they're compensated, to how they ultimately separate from the organization. Consider these kind of experiential points in the employee journey. So as employees are moving into our organization and perhaps separating from our organization, everything that happens in between. There's obviously several other things that you can measure here. For simplicity's sake, 3 to 5. I'm a big fan of the rule of 3. More than 3 things, my head starts to spin a little bit. So I'm going to challenge you to really prioritize the ones that matter here in our next exercise. But for now, just kind of free flow brainstorm, what would be the metrics that would be most important to measure from an employee perspective. So for example, some organizations will say, well, we want to diversify the pool of talent, which is a best practice, that we still hire the best talent because that's an excuse that's often associated with diversity. We will commit to broadening who we interview and who we recruit, and then we will hire the best candidate. So could you measure your recruiting pools? Again, people go to gender and race. You can go to several different dimensions of diversity here. Keep it broad, but keep it on target with how you want to diversify, how you're defining diversity in your organization, and measure it. So you can start with recruiting. That is somewhat of a leading indicator if you're really not as reflective of your customer base or reflective of the communities in which you serve that you want to better reflect. You might start with recruiting. A lot of organizations are starting there. And the key is you can't keep going back to the same places that you were recruiting before if you want to diversify the talent pool. So you have to diversify where you get talent in addition. But measuring it would be a good start. And then year over year, maybe we're improving. Who we promote inside organizations. McKinsey actually measures this in their annual Women Matter report, and it's 2/3 white men that are promoted in most organizations. That's very telling data. Right? Who we're promoting, we're rewarding. Who we're promoting, we want to see more of in the organization. So making sure that we have equitable access to promotion. It's not that we're just promoting diverse groups of people just for the sake of diversity, but really making sure that we're creating promotion pools that are truly diverse and inclusive and reflective of what we want in our organization. Separation data. I can tell you, this is brave. If you measure this, you can pop in the chat if you're seeing different things. Organizations I talk to about this, separation data just for race and gender, women and people of color is 2 to 3 times higher than the white male majority group. So it becomes really clear when you look at this data over time where the gaps are and what the challenges are. So if you're measuring, I'm curious in the chat, other people, yeah, the separations, I want to know who's leaving and why. Yeah, exit data. Yeah, awesome ideas. Good. Oh, I like idea getting added to the mix. Oh, as an acronym, that's fun. So Christine's measuring retention of diverse team members. Who do we lose? Diverse team members more quickly and frequently than those that are not marginalized. Yep, I see that a lot. Dennis shared, in addition to those shown here, we're measuring performance ratings and representation and leadership development. Ooh, that's a good one. Demotions, says Mel. Yep. Stat surveys are incredibly valuable. Yes. And exit data. Yes. So employee perception data. So again, broaden the definition of diversity beyond race and gender. I will say, while those tend to be the 2 primary variables and obviously very underrepresented inside most organizations still today, Think about disabilities, think about LGBTQ, think about gender identity, think about other pieces of diversity and inclusion. And just pop in the chat, other areas that you might consider measuring beyond just race and gender. What this helps do is it limits that zero-sum game mentality. And people often think diversity is just visible. There are so many non-apparent parts of diversity as well. And the white male majority group can often feel more included when it's not just race and gender. It's like, oh, that's their thing, that's not my thing, or this somehow I'm going to lose mentality that it reinforces. Christina, living wage, disparity in pay. Yes, pay, measuring pay, compensation is really important. Inclusive behaviors, as Victoria. Yes, yes, yes. Taking advantage of reimbursement. So these are really cool activities to consider too. Any other areas beyond race and gender? Caregiver status, parental status. Oh, these are interesting. Veterans, I've seen. Age, too, that we're having age, generational diversity. So lots of different ones you can pop in the chat there. And then consider activities. So Victoria, perfect parlay into what I would share is it shouldn't just be like the data that we're seeing with the employee experience. It shouldn't just be who we're hiring and who we're promoting. I would consider adding a few metrics, a mix of metrics that also support activity level. So this could be participation at DEI events, right? This could be the frequency of DEI programs that we have. This could be training. This could be communications. This could be videos. This could be town halls, like so many different things you can do, not just from an event and programming perspective, but also from an overall communication perspective that you can measure. Wellness is an important factor. Just catching up on the chat here. Yeah, age, yes. Can you describe DEI events? So this can be something, my clients handle programs and events, all sorts of different ways. Obviously, I come in a lot of times as a speaker to talk about allyship. That's what I most often talk about. But you can have a senior leader talk about their journey in diversity and inclusion. And I would encourage you not to just make that people of color and women's conversations to have your white male leaders involved in that, and they might share something vulnerable about themselves or something that people didn't know about their journey. So a combination of internal and external partners. Also, what I'm hearing most often inside organizations, and feel free to share on the chat other things you're seeing, inclusive leadership. So yeah, we train our leaders already on leadership, right? That's good. That's good for them, good for leadership. Well, if you add the flavor of inclusion around leadership, it doesn't feel as foreign. And these also help them get their job done. So it's not just about inclusion. It's not just about diversity. Like this is like good for us all to be doing, again, as an overall seamless part of the employee experience. We expect you to be an inclusive leader. And that doesn't mean you have to have manager in your title, right? This isn't positional. I often argue people can lead from anywhere inside organizations. Everyone can choose to be an ally for others. Book clubs, yeah. I have clients that just pick podcasts, TED Talks, and then have circles to come and talk about it. It doesn't have to be super formal. This can be self-led. Employee resource group activities too. So sometimes called ERGs, or I've heard them called business resource groups as well. I'm going to do a webinar, an online workshop next month on that, on how to organize those, how to create programming around that. Because again, oftentimes these are underfunded and under-resourced. So the people that are leading them are usually people of color and women that already care about this and have a day job. And it's not fair to expect them to lead this conversation, right? But could you give them an arsenal of tools, kind of a full gamut of tools that they could use? And most commonly, informal book clubs, podcast conversation, video, TED Talk conversations can be really good to kind of meet people where they're at and provide them with those resources, a repository, if you will. All right, so I want to hear from you. Activity here, and this is in your workbook. So I shared the workbook in the chat at the beginning. Feel free to reference that, take notes there, but what data points are there to measuring? And these are the ones I shared these in your workbook. So this is provided to you on that page. I believe it's the second page. Consider overall headcount, hiring, turnover, promotions, high potential data is really interesting. Salary, someone mentioned that, separations and why. A number of DEI events, programs, training events, pulse survey, so perception data. That could be employee engagement data. I have clients that have specific diversity and inclusion questions within their existing pulse data and employee engagement surveys. Or community activities, external support that we are partnering with these organizations. Increasingly, I'm seeing organizations have an internal focus and an external focus. That would be an example of an external focus. So who wants to add? And if you had trouble with the workbook, I will attach it one more time. It's in the calendar invite, and I shared it a couple times via email, but here it is again. Lynn had psychological safety, willingness to speak up. That perception data is really important. Oh, here's the workbook again. I think I just shared it to one person. Sorry. I'm talking and doing. Other thoughts, diverse slates data. Yeah, so slates, interview slates, promotion slates. That's really important to making sure we diversify the pool of talent. Other metrics you might consider. And this is way more metrics than, by the way, you need to measure. Please don't feel like you need to measure all of these things. This is a full menu. These are the most common ones I hear inside organizations. Laura's had a number of people from diversity groups taking part in a mentoring program. That's super specific. I like that. Board members, Lafonda, tell me more. And it's really interesting. The NASDAQ is requiring that there is at least one diverse member of boards listed on their index. So this is, and I'm like, one, are we still there? But still, you're going to start to see that this be required. So if you're not measuring it, you're going to have to measure it probably in the future when you like to be ahead of that. Supplier diversity, I love that. Developmental opportunities. Oh, recommend, would you recommend is a good metric. Yeah. Would you recommend this organization to somebody different, right? Or somebody like you? That's a really good metric. And Lisa, had anyone use new ERGs to build diverse interview slates when appropriate? Eliana says, let's talk. So perfect opportunity. Feel free to private message each other. Of course, connect with each other on LinkedIn if you have specific questions. So as you're kind of thinking about your organization, what I guide you through here is this is too much. Okay, and we're going to talk about prioritizing it here in a second. What I would say is, what do you, depending on how you are defining diversity, equity, and inclusion today and where you're at right now. So like, where are you 2021? Where do you want to be 2023? You know, we'll talk about time horizons at the end. What are the most important things? Like if you were to look into the future and see it be more diverse, what would it look like? How would you know? Right? So what metrics, what activities would tell you like we have gotten better? That's the way you should look about this list. Don't think of it as a comprehensive, I have to measure all of these things. Just really think about how would you know that we've gotten better at this? Okay, and what data would I have to see to know that is the way we should look about this. Okay, so feel free to keep the chats coming. I'm going to keep us on target time-wise with how to craft the metrics. So this is kind of looking at the data points and really brainstorming. So if I were leading this activity inside an organization, I would probably do like a 90-minute Zoom, virtual conversation, brainstorming the metrics, probably have some of those pre-populated before. Then I would spend the bulk of the time here. So I'm going to guide you through how to facilitate, how to prioritize and craft the right metrics. So it's one thing to have a dashboard with all this data. Maybe your HRIS system has it. Maybe you have kind of all these different options. Have people pull some data together and say, based on what we know, based on what we have access to, based on what we think is important, what story is this data telling us? And this is to the point that I shared in the article and I heard people share in the breakout rooms is, so what? So any good data scientist, I remember in my old MBA days in the quantitative classes, it was always like, so what, so what, so what? And asking that question like 5 times before you really make sure that this is important. And why is it important? So the data is just the data. The point is, why does this matter, right? What is this data telling us? What story can we glean from it? So that's a really good question to ask as a facilitator, because ideally with something like a scorecard or a dashboard for DEI, you want your senior leadership team really involved and bought into what you're measuring. Otherwise, when you report it, you're going to hear blaming behaviors and excuses, which is not helpful to sustaining this. You really want to make sure they're engaged in that so what conversation. The other thing I'd share is, thinking about the gaps. You kind of think, mind the gap. Anyone that's traveled to England, I remember that, hearing that many, many times. But, think about it seriously, is where do you want to be versus where are you today? So that the conversation I had before, you can brainstorm all these data points, perhaps you have access to it and you can easily share it. And when people look at all these graphs and charts, they're like overwhelmed, right? So where are we and where do we want to be? And the key focal point of that conversation should be, how are we defining diversity, equity, inclusion? And then what are our goals? What do we want to see get better? How are we going to measure those things, the gaps? Okay. Pros and cons to setting goals with this. We'll talk through this with the dashboard formation here in a minute. But for now, I just want to say goals are important, because just like anything in business, if we don't have a goal, we're not really focused on it. But if we're really focused on just a couple goals and they're very, they can feel very zero-sum game-ish, meaning the majority group feels left out, if it's not holistic, it can create a defensive behavior where people feel like, oh, they just got promoted because of this, or they just got hired because of this. And that can be hurtful. That can cause a retreat in the conversation. So I like goals. I personally, when you're first starting to measure some of these things, just thinking about, we want to get better. I actually think it's really good to do some baseline data and show that we're getting better at before you even know what a realistic goal is. There's some bold goals being shared in corporate America. Companies like Salesforce, like Intel, several tech companies, the more global a company, more likely they're setting global benchmarks for some of these things. If you have goals, share those in the chat, experiences that you had with goals. But again, gaps, where are we, where do we want to be, is how you should facilitate that conversation. So chance to share again. What questions do you need to ask to craft good DEI metrics? If you think about it, oh yeah, they're the mile markers on the DEI journey. I love that, LaPonda. I see, and let me back up and make sure I've got, while you're all thinking about this, this activity is in your workbook. So some of the questions I shared with you: what story is this data telling us? Where are the gaps? You can ask something like, what dimensions of diversity are improving versus getting worse? That's really interesting to unpack. I find race, it tends to be a bit worse than the gender experience inside the employee experience data that most I review with organizations. Where are we in comparison to the industry? If you're able to access industry comps, that's kind of an interesting resource as well. What areas can we improve realistically with our current resources? All right, so if you're not going to increase resourcing, expecting a bold leap is a little unrealistic. Get checking people on that. It's not that easy. You would never under-resource another initiative inside your company and expect it to grow leaps and bounds. You shouldn't do that for diversity and inclusion either. Awesome. Anonymous survey. Yeah, we asked for it. So someone was sharing they do an anonymous survey. I love that. Yeah, definitely want to keep that anonymous so that people feel safe sharing, to determine if marginalized groups are having a different experience. Yeah. Yeah. So see, people can kind of self-select. Key thing with this is don't make it binary. So if you do ask for demographic variables in those pulse surveys, not just male and female, gender non-binary or gender neutral, however you want to describe that. Also with racial groups, right? Making sure there's a variety so people can find their own identity and also self-select that they don't want to report that data. So Eliana was sharing, it's definitely hiring and recruitment. Even though we may recruit diversity, it's up to the hiring managers to actually hire. Yeah. Yeah, there's kind of a yin and yang to this. We want to diversify the pool, but we want to empower our managers to make the best hire that they feel most comfortable with. But we can certainly measure those things. You can ask for the demographic data on your survey so you can break it down. Yep, someone beat me to that one. That's good. It's important that the diverse pipeline. It's also important to vet the recruiter for their DEI metrics. Yes, yeah, recruiters that don't have diverse data are not going to send you diverse candidate pools of candidates. And push back on recruiters when they say they can't find diverse talent. Like, push back, that's not true. And I've heard so many stories of once they're pushed to find diverse talent and you say, I have to have a diverse pool to be able to interview, we're going to draw the line in the sand there, at least 2 or 3, they suddenly come up with different candidates. Isn't that interesting? We all have affinity bias and tend to surround ourselves with people more like us. I love the mile markers comment. So 360-degree view kind of questions. I love that too. Making it a part of how you evaluate leaders on performance management. Angel, the Mansfield rule, 30% of diverse slates will be the minority. Yes, the Rooney rule falls short. Yeah, the Rooney rules from the NFL, Angel. I love sharing that. Haven't heard of the Mansfield rule, also known as critical mass. So 30% is a tipping point for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we are not there yet. We're not even close. Ooh, I love Heather said, if we don't measure blank, what will we miss? Ooh, that's a good one. I'm adding that one, Heather. What is our desired impact for what we're trying to solve for? Yeah, what do we want to achieve here? What does success look like? Focus groups can be, yeah, listening sessions have been very popular over the last 6 months. Yeah, you must have a panel to interview, not just one manager. Yes, yes, because that bias will show up. Good point. I just discovered it earlier last year. It originated in the legal community. Cool. Diverse panel must look at technical behaviors. Yep, separately. Remove names from resumes. Yep, definitely a best practice. Be careful of external comparisons. Their objectives tend to be different. Thus, the measures are not the same. Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good point. So industry comps, I added that one there. I haven't had clients have as much success with that, but people like to naturally be a little bit competitive with their industry. So if you have that data, most industries fall short. So just keep in mind, sometimes that gets we just say, oh, well, we're doing just as good as our industry. And that falsehood, that false excuse, sometimes those people fall on that. So great question. So again, the goal of this step is to take all the data points and prioritize them. And we really want to prioritize them to 3 to 5 things. Now, if your organization is super data intensive and needs a full-blown dashboard, I have one client that has 25 different metrics. It took them a year to create, and it's very complex every time they have to update it and communicate it, which I tend to think keep it simple, especially if you're just beginning this. So I'll give you some ideas on how to create that dashboard. So first you want to think about frequency. How frequently do we want to communicate this data? I would say I would lean more towards monthly or quarterly versus annually. So if anyone's participated, I know in corporate America employee engagement, we did annually. It was this huge big thing. It took months to get your results back. We were always playing catch up with that, and it didn't move the mark, in my opinion. I think more frequently the better. Monthly might be too much, maybe quarterly, maybe every other month. Just think about frequency and who's going to pull the data. How can you make it as labor inextensive as possible and easy to pull this data? Most likely you have it in your HR system somewhere. If you're a small organization, maybe it's just a simple spreadsheet to start. It doesn't have to be fancy. Transparency. So I like kind of a hybrid approach to how we communicate this. Email certainly is still very much how we communicate today in corporate America, but it needs to be a combination of visual communication as well as interactive communication. And I think this is the challenge that organizations sometimes experience is meetings. When we're having these meetings, people could ask questions that we don't have the answers to or we're not prepared. That's why being transparent and talking about how important this is over time can help with that conversation. So could you have town hall meetings? Certainly the higher levels of leadership need to be talking about this as much as they possibly can. I have some CEOs that just do a quick 2-minute video on here's the state of where we're at with diversity. We talked about it last summer. We're still talking about it. We're still not where we want to be. Here's where we are. And these are the things we're measuring. That's awesome. It doesn't have to be this overwhelming, huge presentation or rehearsed. I actually think the more vulnerable, the more honest it is, the better it's going to come across, and the more people will respond to it and truly believe this is important. That's a consistency and intentional factor I mentioned earlier. It has to be consistent and intentional over time. A shared site. If you feel so compelled to share this on a Google Drive or shared drive, wherever you have communications, I have clients that have an ERG kind of set up website where they have their benchmarks and measurements. Anyone can go in and see them live even. So just consider where people are getting information in your organization and how you can make it seamless with how information is already being shared. Hey, we're an email culture, we're a meeting culture, we're a data-driven culture, we're dashboards, we're a Slack channel culture, whatever it is, meet people where they're at and provide this information and be transparent about it. Then you need to think about audience. So one of the biggest misses with DEI is this middle manager bucket. I'd be curious to hear from you on the chat how you're communicating with middle managers. So much of how we do DEI starts with leadership, right? They have to be involved, they have to be engaged, they have to be talking about this, they have to believe it's important, yes. And then we do all employee events, programs, things for everybody. We often don't target this middle band. That's where you think about that employee experience. So much of the employee experience is tied at that middle band. The middle managers are the essence of the employee experience. If your manager's not talking about it, if your manager's not prepared, if your manager's not measuring it, you're going to check out and not care about it too, unless you're just naturally curious and excited about it. So getting at that middle manager, I like to think about previews, letting them see the data, letting them be accountable to the data, talking about it in their performance reviews, how they're driving diversity on their team, how they're participating in the activities. So just make sure you don't miss that. A lot of organizations go top down or bottom up, but they forget about the, I call them the magic middle. Oftentimes the frozen middle, because they are mostly the majority group, 2/3 white males that don't always feel so comfortable having this conversation. All right, so last activity, we kind of in the home stretch here. How do you envision your DEI dashboard? So I'm sharing a sample here. I put this in your workbook too. I also will be sharing these slides, a PDF version of these slides, so you can get this as well as the recording later this afternoon. So don't feel like you have to feverishly take notes on all of this. But if I had to just distill it to, again, this is probably more of a medium-sized organization that hasn't measured things before, making it simple, right? Just a spreadsheet to start, maybe some charts, maybe it has some pivot tables, but at a minimum, I would pick 3 to 5 metrics. Okay. So I might pick a mix of activity level and representation targets with the employee experience. So I might think, what's most important to my organization, right? Hiring, because we're not very diverse at all. We have, this representation, it's not diverse. We're not representing our communities. We're not mirroring our customer base. We really need to hire. We need to work on the diversity, the D side of things, in addition to the activities on the I side of things with inclusion. Then we might think about promotions, and maybe specifically we're very male dominated with our promotions and our senior leadership team. So maybe we need to really think about gender identity with promotions. Another one, retention of diverse groups by percentage. I mentioned that the separation data tends to be 2 to 3x higher. So who are we retaining? Who are we losing? And why, right? That so what question's really powerful with that one. People of color, POC, sometimes BI POC is used. But people of color, total head count, racial representation, maybe we're not doing so well on that too, and the retention piece is missing. And then activity levels, something like DEI total programs, communications, videos, leadership team announcements. So just kind of, I think some great ideas are being shared in the chat with Microsoft team pages. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, it takes time to shift, especially, think about where you are on the journey. Right. So this is why I kind of like 3-year goals, because if you create a year goal, like for next year, people feel like, oh, I got to do this right away. And then they might maybe be disappointed or maybe not have the right resources. So if I were to put together a dashboard, I'd want a retroactive look into last year. I'd probably want 12 to 18 months of data looking back so that you could start to baseline it and compare yourself to yourself. And then as you're measuring it, maybe monthly, quarterly, annually, whatever you decide to do, being transparent about it, comparing yourself and seeing year over year, quarter over quarter, how are we improving our metrics? You can also break this down by leader and by function of an organization. That really drills the accountability to those specific sections. And we expect you to be better. Okay, just saying that at a minimum. And then maybe having an overarching like big vision. So a lot of organizations right now are setting like 5-year targets, maybe 10-year targets. I like that because it gives us time, but it still reinforces accountability that we're going to have a goal around this, just like we would in anything else in business, and we're going to measure it over time. So think about your dashboard, and as you're sharing thoughts, love the ideas being shared here. Anyone, I know we've got about 5 more minutes, so we'll certainly have some time for questions, but anyone have any thoughts on what metrics you might include, what your dashboard might look like? Anybody that's put together a dashboard before that wants to share additional thoughts to this? Other thoughts on the DEI dashboard? So I just picked a random 5 that I liked. Of course, in a real example, we would want to pull the data, like just like I showed in this process, pull a really good list of data, then prioritize it. Laurel has used Tableau, and then you can identify the variables that you're looking at and look at intersectionality. Oh, Laurel, good point. So intersectionality, intersection of more than one dimension of diversity, most commonly used with women of color, race and gender, but certainly even more as you can slice and dice them and layer them together. Some organizations have like PhD data scientists working on this too. So I'll just say that with caveat. This is more process I'm sharing with you today is really to generate ideas if you're struggling to put together that dashboard or want to improve it. Duana's, oh, HRIS team, perfect timing. Yeah, so there is this data. So if you get the excuse that we don't have this data, we're not capturing it, I promise you some of this data is shared. So I vetted this with my HR leader clients, and they said, yeah, that data is very easy to capture in most HRIS systems, even the most simplistic. Angel, had we track data on who is selected for key professional development? Awesome. So that says a lot. Brian, dashboard should be a balance of measures. Yeah. So I like activity and demographic balances. Victoria had Power BI as another tool to quickly look at various slices. Awesome. Thank you. Jay, trending is helpful to show where you'll end up if you continue on the same page. Yeah. What if we do nothing? This is the trend line continues. HCMI is a great tool for DEI analytics. Office Vibe has a good dashboard for intersectionality. Dennis shared a link as well. So good stuff. I love that. Love y'all sharing in the chat. The last thing I'd share with y'all, I've given you a lot of content. You all have shared a lot of content. So thank you for joining me in this conversation and being interactive. I'd love to leave on a high note. One thing you'll do as a result of the conversation. So it's an hour of your life. It's a new year, although I don't know how much different it will be, at least at the onset of this year, hopefully much different later this year. But what's one thing you can take from this conversation to take back to your organization? Just one thing you'll do with the information you shared. Certainly could be to do some of this activity with your leadership team. It could be to check out some of these great tools, analytical tools that people have shared in the chat. Chris had consider how to increase middle manager engagement. I have some ideas, Chris. Education is the biggest gap for that middle manager. And there's so much vying for their time priority wise. So honestly, when I talk to middle managers, they just don't think the DEI conversation is usually for them, which is so wrong. Lynn, report data and ERGs and challenge and come up with ideas to improve. Yep, Dennis had proposed that we include at least a couple of activity-based leading indicators. Yes, leading indicators. So if we're doing these things, we should be driving diversity and inclusion. We don't always want to just retroactive, especially separation data. It's like, well, that's not leading, that's lagging. Other things. I invite you, if this conversation is helpful, I do strategy engagements, like I said, 90-minute sessions to guide your team through this and build out your dashboard for you. So if you're interested in that program or how to build your strategy, I offer those services to clients as well as training. So Lead Like an Ally, my book that I shared at the beginning, has dozens of choices of training programs, especially for that middle manager. It's really targeted towards them. So from everything from how to lead with empathy and how to lead with influence and unconscious bias. So if you're interested, message me, julie@nextpivotpoint.com. I post daily on Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn, so you can look for me if we're not already connected there. Next Pivot Point or Julie Kratz on LinkedIn. And as we're wrapping up, we just have a minute or so. Anything I didn't get to? What questions do you still have? Thank you. I know the chat was.
Hey, Julie.
Yeah, go for it.
One question that I saw that I'm not sure you saw in the chat. What's a good resource for finding industry benchmarks?
Oh, so okay. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate that. I missed that one. So I have not had a lot of success with this. It, of course, depends on your industry. I have a client, for example, that is IT consulting, that they went to some of their lead recruiters and asked for industry comps and benchmarks. They were told they could build it for them, but they didn't already have it. So sometimes you can go to kind of your industry associations and get this data. Sometimes they might not have it yet themselves. So I think we all have to kind of take that ownership and drive that and push that. But industry associations, some will have this. Something like the tech industry, for example, very, very on the leading edge of this from an industry perspective. Higher ed, healthcare, some of the industries I serve, but some of them, manufacturing, for example, I haven't found good data there. Like I mentioned, IT consulting, we couldn't find good data there. So it depends on your industry, but I would definitely push your associations and existing data partners. Awesome. What else? What other questions? Eliana had, our goal is to set up surveys quarterly and begin the process of setting up the dashboard. That's awesome. So again, I will share this recording. I will share the PowerPoint. You've got the workbook to take and use as much of these tools on your own inside organizations. I just ask, hey, if I could be helpful, let's have a chat. I do have an online workshop coming up. Next one is February 10th. Very similar structure to this. If you liked this, come back, invite your team. It's all about how to set up DEI councils inside your organization and how to facilitate engagement with your ERGs, your employee resource groups. Getting a lot of questions about that now. How do we divide the swim lanes? Who's accountable for what? How do we engage them? How do we resource them? How do we do more with less? Which isn't that always the challenge? So come back if that's interesting to you. Oh, Laura's had a question. Recently, a woman has been promoted to the EXCO, and when communicating about the CEO man, she mentioned promoting her was a proof of their commitment to increase gender balance. Do you think this is okay to say or not? As employees might think it was only recruited. That's the downfall of that, of saying, well, that was the only reason. I think emphasizing we are committed to this, and this is an example of someone that we have promoted to show that we are committed to this. She was promoted because of these things. So I think emphasizing it wasn't just gender, it's these skills that she's bringing to the table. But I think it's okay to emphasize we are deeply committed to this. This is an example of success. And she's awesome because of all these other things. Awesome. Yeah, people need to see it to believe it. Please.
This is Tracy. I wanted to ask a question regarding your definition of, you said diversity is not, it's groups, not individuals. So in light of that, how do you interpret, or how do you respond to people that talk about cognitive diversity, and how do you get white males, for example, involved in diversity and helping them to see that it reflects them as well? So they're part of diversity.
Yeah.
And then the metrics, I don't see very many metrics that measures cognitive diversity. So did you have any ideas about that?
Yeah. And that's usually self-reported inside organizations. So you just have to figure out how you could find that data or how you want to slice and dice that and measure that. But cognitive disability is certainly an area in that diversity dimension of disabilities I shared earlier that you can dive into if that's important to you. Your question about getting white men involved and seeing beyond, so it's not diversity, it's just a label on an individual, but they're groups. There's a really cool exercise called the diversity wheel. One of the best graphics I've seen representative of this is Sylvia Duckworth has a graphic called the privilege wheel, I believe is what it's called if you search for it. I posted on my Instagram maybe a month ago and just was amazed how much feedback I got on it. But it covers everything from age to ethnicity to race to gender to socioeconomic status. Once, especially a white male majority person looks at that group and identifies with usually a couple of the key sub-factors or dimensions of diversity, it's like, oh, this isn't just us versus them. Like it's a we conversation. And these are diverse groups of people, different types of identities, right, that I might identify with. And I'm more than just that identity. I have several identities that I bring. So I'd encourage you to check out, if you Google search diversity wheel or privilege wheel, Sylvia Duckworth's is my favorite, but there's like 1,000 of them out there. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you very much.
Of course. That's not okay. Oh, some good stuff. Yep. Awesome. Good stuff in the chat. Awesome. GDIB, I'm seeing in the chat too. So thanks, LaPonda, for sharing it. And then Laura shared the wheel of privilege. Yes. That's a great exercise to do with your team to see beyond those dimensions and layer in interesting things, like you said, cognitive disabilities too. Well, we're 5 minutes over. I believe I have a crying baby downstairs, so I apologize that she woke up 10 minutes early today. So if anybody heard the background noise, I'm working on soundproofing. I've got a 3-month-old baby that sometimes cooperates when I'm working and sometimes doesn't. So my apologies on that. And thank you. Thank you for being with us today. I appreciate you. I'll get the recording and the slides in your inbox this afternoon. Stay in touch and let me know how I can help. I hope to see you back next time.